The air in the cemetery was thick with the scent of damp red earth and expensive perfume. White canopies, stark against the brooding Lagos sky, flapped in a wind that carried whispers of sorrow and disbelief. Chief Funmilayo Adeleke, the lioness of Lagos business, was dead. Her casket, a gleaming masterpiece of polished mahogany and gold, rested above the dark, waiting mouth of the grave. Inside lay the woman who had built an empire from her late husband's legacy, a matriarch whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in boardrooms across the continent. Her husband, Jide, a man half her age and twice as handsome, stood beside the casket, a picture of perfect grief. He dabbed a silk handkerchief at his eyes, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed too theatrical to be real. The pastor raised his hands, his voice beginning the final rites, and the grave workers tensed, ready to lower the titan into the earth. But then a voice, raw and powerful, ripped through the solemn quiet. "Stop! For the love of God, stop! She is not dead!" The sound was so jarring that the pastor's Bible slipped from his fingers. Every head turned, a sea of black head ties and tailored suits, their gazes fixed on the source of the sacrilege. A man, ragged and wild, was shoving his way through the stunned crowd. His clothes were tattered, his beard a tangled mat, and his eyes burned with a fire that seemed both mad and utterly sane. He was a ghost from the gutters, a spectre of poverty crashing a billionaire's farewell. Security guards, large men in crisp black suits, moved to intercept him, their faces grim, but the man was surprisingly agile, dodging their grasp like a phantom. He broke through the final line of mourners and stumbled to a halt at the edge of the burial mat, his chest heaving. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the casket, a finger gnarled and stained with the grime of the streets. "She is alive!" he cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. "I swear it on my life, she is breathing!" Jide's face, moments before a mask of sorrow, twisted into a snarl of pure fury. "Get this madman out of here," he hissed at the guards. "Have you no respect? My wife is gone. Let us bury her in peace." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Who was this man? A beggar? A lunatic? Phones were already being raised, the flashing red lights of recording icons blinking in the gloom, eager to capture the unfolding drama. The homeless man ignored Jide completely, his wild eyes scanning the front row of family members until they landed on a stern, older woman whose face was a mirror of Funmilayo's. "Auntie Ronke," he pleaded, his voice softening. "You must listen. Do you remember the story of the sleeping hibiscus, the flower that closes at night only to bloom again at dawn? She told us that story as children. A collective gasp swept through the family section. The pet name, the childhood story. It was a secret held within the tightest circle of the Adeleke clan." Auntie Ronke's eyes widened, a flicker of confusion warring with her grief. How could this stranger, this creature from the fringes of society, know a memory so intimate, a story Funmilayo had only ever shared with her closest blood relatives? It made no sense. Jide stepped forward, his body physically shielding the casket from the intruder. "He's a charlatan, a fraud! He must have overheard something. Security, I order you to remove him now." The guards surged forward again, but the man held his ground. He looked directly at Jide, and the madness in his eyes sharpened into a piercing, knowing glare. "The poison is called Asoju Urun," he said, the Yoruba words falling like stones into the silence. "The herald of sleep. It is made from the root of the Iwerepe vine. It does not kill. It paralyzes. It makes the heart beat so slowly that only the most skilled herbalist can detect it. You gave it to her in her evening tea, didn't you? You and the doctor who signed her death certificate so quickly." The mention of a specific poison, a method, and an accomplice turned the atmosphere from a spectacle into a potential crime scene. The air crackled with tension. "Dr. Ibrahim, The family physician, who had been standing quietly in the background, went visibly pale, a sheen of sweat instantly appearing on his brow. He looked from Jide to the homeless man, his composure shattering like glass. The crowd was now a buzzing hive of suspicion and fear. The mourners were no longer looking at the homeless man as a lunatic, but as a prophet. They looked at Jide's panicked rage, at Dr. Ibrahim's terrified expression, and doubt began to seed in their hearts. Auntie Ronki took a hesitant step forward, her hand clutching the pearls at her throat. The story of the sleeping hibiscus was one thing, a lucky guess perhaps, but the mention of a specific rare traditional poison was another. It spoke of knowledge, not madness. What are you saying?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man's gaze softened as he looked at her. "I am saying that your sister is trapped inside her own body, listening to you prepare to bury her alive," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The antidote is simple, but it must be given before the sun sets. If you lower her into that grave, you will be committing a murder that her husband has already started." He then reached into the grimy depths of his tattered coat and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden gourd, stoppered with a piece of cloth. "The cure is here," he declared, holding it up for all to see. "Now, are you going to let her die for a second time? Or are you going to let me save her life?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge that shattered the funeral's decorum. Jide's handsome face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "This is a desecration," he roared, his voice trembling. "He is trying to perform some kind of ritual on my wife's body. This is an abomination." He turned to the pastor. "Father, please continue the service. Ignore this demon." But the pastor was frozen, his eyes wide, looking from the strange man to the sweating doctor to the furious husband. The mourners were in an uproar, shouting amongst themselves. Some yelled to throw the man out, while others, captivated by the chilling possibility that he was telling the truth, shouted to open the casket. Auntie Ronka, a woman of immense pride and tradition, found herself at a crossroads. To believe this man was to accept a monstrous betrayal at the heart of her family. To ignore him was to risk condemning her sister to the most horrific death imaginable. She looked at Jide's desperate, frantic eyes, and then at the homeless man's steady, pleading gaze. A cold dread, colder than any grief she had felt all day, washed over her. She made a decision. She turned to the two largest of her nephews and spoke a single word, her voice ringing with the authority of the family's new matriarch. "Open it." The command cut through the chaos, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind whipping against the tents. Jide stared at her, his mouth agape in disbelief, his perfect plan crumbling into dust before his very eyes. The chapter of Funmilayo Adeleke's life was supposed to be over, but a new, terrifying one was just beginning. Jide lunged towards Auntie Ronka, his composure completely gone. "Have you lost your mind?" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "This is my wife. You will not defile her memory based on the ramblings of a filthy beggar." But Auntie Ronka stood firm, her expression as unyielding as granite. Her nephews, two colossal men who owed their positions in the company to their aunt, moved to her side, forming a human wall between her and Jide. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. The grief that had united the family was now cracking, revealing the fissures of suspicion that had long existed beneath the surface. Many in the family had been wary of Jide, of his smooth charm and his obvious hunger for the Adeleke fortune. Now the beggar's words were giving voice to their deepest fears. The mourners watched, transfixed, a silent jury to a drama more gripping than any Nollywood movie. The air was electric with a single unspoken question. What if he was right? The grave workers, caught in the middle, looked uncertainly at the pastor, who seemed to have shrunk into his robes, offering no guidance. All authority had been seized by two opposing forces, the frantic husband and the resolute sister. The homeless man, Adekunle, stood silently, holding the small gourd, his part in the drama momentarily played. He had lit the fuse. Now he could only watch as the explosion tore through the family. Auntie Ronke's voice was low and dangerous. "Jide, my sister is in that casket." The man mentioned a secret she shared only with her blood. He named a poison known only in the deepest parts of our ancestral lands. "If you have nothing to hide, you will stand aside and let us look upon her face one last time. If you resist, you will only prove his point." Her logic was a razor. Slicing through Jide's blustering rage and exposing the panic beneath, he opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His eyes darted around, looking for an ally, but he found none. Even his own friends in the crowd were looking at him with a new, unsettling curiosity. Dr. Ibrahim tried to intervene, stepping forward with a semblance of medical authority. "Please," he said, his voice strained, "we must be rational. Chief Adeleke suffered a massive coronary event. I was there. I did everything I could. Opening the casket now it's a health risk. It's a violation of protocol." But his plea sounded weak, his medical jargon hollow against the primal fear that had gripped the assembly. The homeless man let out a short, bitter laugh. Protocol? Was it protocol to sign her death certificate less than an hour after her collapse? Was it protocol to refuse an autopsy? Was it protocol to schedule her burial less than 48 hours after she drew her last supposed breath? Every question was a bullet, and Dr. Ibrahim flinched with each one. The crowd began to murmur again, louder this time. The speed of the funeral had been a topic of gossip. It was unseemly, rushed. Funmilayo was a great woman, an Iroko tree in the community. Her funeral should have been a week-long affair, a celebration of life with guests from around the world. Instead, Jide had insisted on a quick, quiet burial, citing his unbearable grief and his desire to not prolong the agony. At the time, some had seen it as the act of a devoted, heartbroken husband. Now, it seemed sinister, a desperate attempt to hide a terrible secret. Auntie Ronke's nephews did not wait for further instruction. With grim determination, they moved towards the casket. The crowd surged forward, a wave of bodies pressing in, their phones held high. The quiet cemetery had become a theatre, and the final act was about to begin. The two men reached the mahogany box, their large hands hovering over the golden clasps. The sound they made as they undid the latches was unnaturally loud in the tense silence, a series of sharp metallic clicks that echoed like gunshots. Click, click, click. Each sound seemed to deepen the pallor on Jide's face. He was trembling now, not with grief, but with the violent terror of a man whose world was about to end. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes wide and wild, searching for an escape that did not exist. The final latch was undone. The two men exchanged a look, then placed their hands on the lid of the casket. The collective breath of hundreds of people was held in a single agonizing moment of suspense. What would they find inside? The peaceful face of a dead woman or something else? Would this homeless man be proven a fool, a madman to be pitied and discarded? Or would he be revealed as a savior, a prophet who had stopped an unspeakable evil? Every possibility was a new dimension of horror. Auntie Ronke braced herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was not sure which outcome she feared more. The silence stretched, becoming so profound that the distant hum of Lagos traffic seemed to fade into nothingness. There was only the casket, the wind, and the unspoken terror that bound them all together. The lid was heavy, and the nephews grunted with effort as they began to lift it. It rose slowly, agonizingly, revealing the satin-lined interior inch by inch. The suspense was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone, making it hard to breathe. The moment of truth had arrived, a moment that would either confirm a tragedy or reveal a conspiracy of unimaginable darkness. The lid was finally open. For a moment no one spoke. They could all see her now lying still and serene, and then a woman in the front row screamed. It was not a scream of grief, but a scream of pure, unadulterated shock. The chapter of Funmilayo's death had been pried open, and what lay inside was a truth far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. Chief Funmilayo Adeleke lay on a bed of white silk, dressed in a gown of shimmering gold lace. She looked regal, peaceful, and unequivocally dead. Her skin was cool to the touch, her hands folded over her chest. Her face a serene mask. For a heart-stopping moment, a wave of disappointment and anger washed over the crowd. The homeless man was a fraud after all. He had turned their sacred grief into a vulgar circus. Jide let out a shaky, triumphant laugh. You see, she is gone. Now for God's sake, close the casket and let my wife rest. He shot a venomous glare at Adekunle, his eyes promising retribution. But Adekunle was not looking at him. He pushed past the nephews and leaned over the casket, his eyes intensely focused on Funmilayo's face. The crowd watched, confused. Look closer, Adekunle whispered, his voice urgent. He pointed with a trembling finger. Look at her eyelashes, they are moving. Everyone craned their necks, squinting. It was almost impossible to see. A flicker so faint, it could have been a trick of the light or the wind. But it was there, a tiny microscopic tremor in the fine hairs of her left eyelid. It was a sign of life so small, so insignificant, that anyone else would have missed it. But Adekunle had been watching for it, praying for it. It was the one sign that Asoju Uran poison could not completely erase. A collective gasp, soft and hesitant, rippled through those standing closest. It wasn't their imagination. Her lashes had moved. Auntie Ronki stumbled forward, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw it too, a silent biological protest against the fate that had been chosen for her. The tremor was life, refusing to be extinguished. All doubt vanished from her face, replaced by a horrified certainty. She turned to Adekunle, her eyes pleading. Do it, she commanded, her voice shaking. Whatever you must do, do it now. Adekunle needed no further encouragement. He unstoppered the small wooden gourd, and a pungent, earthy smell filled the air, the scent of crushed herbs and bitter roots. Jide let out a roar of protest. No, you will not pour that filth on her. He lunged forward, but Ronki's nephews caught him, their hands like iron clamps on his arms. He struggled, thrashing like a wild man, his cries a mixture of fury and desperation. She's dead! Can't you see she's dead? You are letting a madman desecrate her body. His panic only served to confirm his guilt. If he truly believed she was dead, what harm could a few drops of herbal liquid do? His terror was not for her memory, but for the possibility that she might wake up and expose him. Adekunle ignored the commotion. With a surprisingly steady hand, he tilted Funmilayo's head gently to the side, using his thumb to part her lips. They were cool and stiff. He squeezed the gourd, and a single dark drop of liquid fell onto her tongue. The effect was not immediate. An entire minute passed. Then two. The only sounds were Jide's muffled struggles and the frantic whispers of the crowd. The hope that had ignited moments before began to flicker and die. Perhaps the tremor had been a fluke, a post-mortem muscle spasm. Dr. Ibrahim, seeing his chance, spoke up, his voice regaining some of its lost confidence. This is madness. It's a nerve reaction. It means nothing. You are wasting precious time and violating the dignity of the deceased. He sounded professional, logical. But then Adekunle, who had been counting under his breath, squeezed another drop into Funmilayo's mouth. He leaned his ear close to her chest, listening intently. Wait, he breathed. Wait! The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The crowd was a frozen tableau of suspense. Then a sound. It was faint, a tiny flutter from within the casket, like the sound of a trapped bird's wings. A small, almost inaudible sigh escaped Funmilayo's lips. Her chest, which had been perfectly still, gave a weak but unmistakable shudder. It was not a nerve reaction. It was a breath. A shallow, ragged, but very real breath. The woman who screamed before screamed again, but this time it was a sound of joyful, terrified disbelief. The change that followed was like watching a sunrise happen in fast forward. A faint flush of pink began to creep back into Funmilayo's pale cheeks. Her fingers, which had been locked together, twitched. Another breath followed, this one stronger, a shuddering gasp that was both horrifying and miraculous to witness. Her throat moved as she swallowed, the herbal remedy beginning its work, fighting the paralytic agent in her veins. Jide stopped struggling. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. He stared at the woman in the casket, his wife, as she slowly, impossibly, returned to the land of the living. He looked like a man watching his own ghost rise from the grave. Adekunle leaned over Funmilayo, his voice a soft, urgent whisper. "Chief Funmilayo, can you hear me? You are safe. You are not dead. Open your eyes. Come back to us." As if responding to his voice, her eyelids began to flutter. Not the tiny tremor from before, but a deliberate, struggling movement. She was fighting her way back from the abyss, breaking through the chemical chains that had bound her. The crowd was in absolute chaos, a maelstrom of shouts, prayers, and sobs. This was not a funeral anymore. It was a resurrection. And then, her eyes, the fierce, intelligent eyes of the Lioness of Lagos, flew open. They were cloudy, confused, but they were open. She took another deeper breath, and her first word, raspy and weak, echoed in the stunned silence. "Jide." The name was not a question of love, but one of accusation. The sound of it made Jide crumble, his legs giving way as if his very bones had dissolved in terror. The scene exploded into pandemonium. It was a single moment of supernatural whiplash, as an entire crowd of mourners saw their world turn upside down. A funeral had become a crime scene. A dead woman had become a living witness, and a grieving husband had become a terrified suspect. People screamed, some falling to their knees in prayer, others scrambling backward as if they had seen a spirit. The pastor was babbling passages from the Bible, his voice trembling with awe and fear. Auntie Ronki was openly weeping, not with grief, but with a terrible, earth-shaking joy. She rushed to her sister's side, grabbing her hand. "Funmi! Oh God, Funmi, you're warm!" she cried, her tears splashing onto the mahogany casket. Funmilayo's gaze was still unfocused, but it shifted from the sky to the faces peering down at her. She blinked slowly, like someone waking from a long and terrible dream. Her eyes found Jide, who was being held up by the nephews, his face the colour of ash. A flicker of memory, of terror ignited in her expression. Her lips parted, and she tried to speak again, her voice a little stronger this time. "You," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. It was you. That was all it took. Jide's terror morphed into a final, desperate act of violence. With a guttural roar, he broke free from the nephew's grasp. He did not run. He lunged, not at Adekunle, not at the guards, but directly at Funmilayo, his hands outstretched like claws, aiming for her throat. His intention was clear and horrifying, to finish the job he had started. If he could silence her now before she could say another word, it would be his word against a madman's. The crowd screamed in terror. But Jide never reached her. Adekunle, who had been standing watch like a guardian angel, moved with a speed that belied his ragged appearance. He threw himself between Jide and the casket, taking the full force of the younger man's attack. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, Jide punching and scratching like a cornered beast. The mourners, shocked out of their paralysis, surged forward. Several men from the family grabbed Jide, pulling him off the struggling Adekunle. They pinned him to the ground, his face pressed into the red earth he had intended to bury his wife in. He was screaming incoherently, his elegant suit covered in dirt, the mask of the sophisticated husband completely obliterated, revealing the monster beneath. Amid the chaos, the wail of sirens grew louder. Someone had had the presence of mind to call the police when the disturbance first started. 2 police vans screeched to a halt at the cemetery gates, and officers began pouring out, their expressions bewildered as they took in the scene of a funeral in complete disarray. A woman sitting up in her own casket, and a well-dressed man being held down like a common criminal. The senior officer, a grizzled inspector, approached Auntie Ronka, his eyes wide. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Before Ronka could answer, Funmilayo spoke. Her voice was weak but clear, ringing with the authority that had built an empire. She pointed a trembling finger at her husband, who was still thrashing on the ground, and then at Dr. Ibrahim, who was trying to slip away unnoticed into the crowd. "Arrest them," she commanded. "They tried to murder me." There was no ambiguity in her voice. It was the testimony of the victim herself. The inspector didn't hesitate. He barked orders, and his men descended. They hauled a screaming, cursing Jide to his feet and slapped handcuffs on his wrists. 2 other officers caught Dr. Ibrahim at the edge of the crowd, his escape attempt thwarted. He collapsed, sobbing, making no effort to resist as they cuffed him. The family doctor, who had sworn an oath to do no harm, was now a co-conspirator in an attempted murder. The drama was over, but the story was just beginning. Funmilayo, with the help of her sister, slowly sat up further in the casket. Her gaze moved past her arrested husband, past the shocked faces of her friends and family, and settled on the man who was now picking himself up from the ground. His coat was torn, and there was a fresh scratch on his cheek, but his eyes were calm. He had saved her, this stranger, this homeless man. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. Past the grime and the tattered clothes, there was something familiar in the high cheekbones, in the intensity of his gaze. It was a face from another lifetime, a memory buried under decades of wealth and responsibility. A name from her childhood village, a boy she used to run with through the fields of hibiscus flowers, rose from the depths of her memory. It seemed impossible, a dream within a dream, but the face was unmistakable, aged by hardship, but fundamentally the same. "Kunle?" she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so long. "Adekunle Okoro? Is that you?" The homeless man's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. He gave a small, weary nod. The lioness of Lagos and the beggar from the bridge were not strangers after all. They were ghosts from each other's past, brought together by a crime that had inadvertently unearthed a long-forgotten connection, a twist of fate that no one could have predicted. The world is full of stories, but some are too incredible to believe. If you're enjoying this one so far, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with your friends. It helps our channel grow and bring you more tales like this. Now tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were a mourner at that funeral? Would you have believed the homeless man, or would you have dismissed him as a madman? Let's get back to the story. The man who stood in tattered clothes at the cemetery was a ghost of a life that had once been vibrant and full. Before the streets claimed him, he was Professor Adekunle Okoro, a man whose passion was not for money or power, but for the grand, sweeping story of history. At the University of Lagos, his lectures were legendary, his office a sanctuary of books and ideas. His world was not the cold concrete under the Falomo Bridge, but a modest, loving home filled with the scent of his wife Aniki's cooking and the sound of his 6-year-old daughter Amara's laughter. His life was a testament to quiet success, a universe built on love and knowledge. The name Funmilayo Adeleke was a whisper from a distant past, a childhood memory of a girl from his village whose family had vanished into the golden promise of Lagos. Their paths had diverged so completely that he never imagined they would cross again. He was a man who believed in the ordered progression of things, in the systems that governed society, and in the fundamental principle that justice, though sometimes slow, was inevitable. He taught his students that history was a relentless march forward, and he had no reason to believe his own life would be a cruel exception to that rule. His world was small but complete, a fragile ecosystem of happiness that he believed was protected by the laws of fairness and decency. He was a good man, living a good life, utterly blind to the brutal randomness of the storm that was gathering just over the horizon. The storm broke on a Saturday. The sky was clear, the air was warm, and the world felt safe. Adekunle, Anike, and Amara were returning from a trip to the market. Their car filled with groceries and the cheerful sound of Amara singing off-key. Anike was laughing, her head thrown back, a picture of pure joy that would be seared into Kunle's memory forever. Then came the screech of tyres, a sound that tore a hole in the fabric of the afternoon. A sleek black Mercedes, moving at an impossible speed, ran a red light and ploughed directly into them. The world became a chaotic symphony of shattering glass, twisting metal, and a sudden, violent silence. Kunle survived, protected by a collapsing driver's side door, but he awoke in the sterile, white silence of a hospital room, to a world that had been emptied of all its meaning. The doctor's words were meant to be gentle, but they were hammer blows that shattered his soul. Anike and Amara were gone, killed instantly. In the haze of his grief, one image from the crash scene kept replaying in his mind. The driver of the Mercedes, a young man reeking of expensive cologne and alcohol, stumbling out of his car and making a frantic phone call, not to the police, but to his father, a powerful senator. In that moment, Adekunle's tragedy began its transformation into a profound and soul-crushing injustice. The ordered world he had so deeply believed in began to crack and fall away, revealing the terrifying void beneath. His fight for justice was a slow, agonizing lesson in the true nature of power. He arrived at the police station with the hope that the system would work, but he was met with a wall of indifference that soon hardened into outright obstruction. The police report was mysteriously altered, the driver's blood alcohol level recorded as 0. Witnesses who had given vivid accounts at the scene suddenly developed amnesia, their memories clouded by fear or bribery. The case was quietly dismissed for a supposed lack of evidence. The senator's son, whose name was a shield against all consequences, was never even charged. Adekunle poured his savings into hiring a lawyer, a good man who initially promised him the world, but who dropped the case weeks later, his face pale with a fear he refused to name. Kunle's academic mind could not comprehend it. The evidence was irrefutable. The crime was clear. Yet every door he knocked on was slammed in his face. His grief, with no outlet, began to curdle into a black, corrosive despair. He saw photos online of the young man who had destroyed his world, celebrating on a yacht in Dubai, his smile a testament to his untouchability. The injustice was a living monster, stalking him, whispering that the lives of his wife and child had been meaningless, a small price to pay for a rich man's fleeting pleasure. The moral arc of the universe, he finally understood, didn't bend on its own. It was bent and twisted by the brute force of wealth. The man he was, Professor Adekunle Okoro, died long before he started sleeping on the streets. He could no longer stand in front of a lecture hall and speak of progress and order. The words felt like ash in his mouth. The university, once his sanctuary, became a haunted house, every corridor echoing with memories of a life that was gone forever. He pushed away his concerned colleagues, isolating himself in a prison of his own grief. He began to drink, not for pleasure, but for oblivion. chasing a quiet darkness that the daylight world would not allow. The drinking cost him his job. The loss of his job cost him his house. He sold his books, the physical manifestations of his soul, for a few naira to buy another bottle. Each transaction was a small suicide, another piece of the professor given away. He drifted through the city, a spectre of sorrow, until he had exhausted every ounce of goodwill and burned every bridge to his past. The final step, the one from which there was no return, was onto the streets. Under the roaring traffic of the Falomo Bridge, amidst the other broken and forgotten souls, he finally found a place where he belonged. The shame was afire at first, but it eventually cooled into the numb embers of acceptance. He was no longer a professor, a husband, or a father. He was just Kunle, a ghost in the machine of Lagos. Life on the street was a brutal education. It stripped him of his intellectual arrogance and taught him the primal laws of survival. He learned the rhythm of the city's underbelly, the language of desperation, and the geography of hunger. The years passed in a monotonous blur of heat, rain, and a loneliness so profound, it was like a constant companion. His old life became a story he told himself sometimes, a myth about a different man in a different world. Then came the rain, a torrential downpour that drove him to seek shelter in the shadows of a high-end restaurant in Ikoyi. It was there, huddled against a wall, that he heard the voice from inside a luxury car. The voice was slick with arrogance, gloating on the phone about a plan executed to perfection. The speaker, Jide, mentioned a woman named Funmilayo, a poison called asoju urun, and a swift burial. The name Funmilayo jolted him. It was a name from his childhood. The name of the poison was a name from his grandmother's folklore. In that moment, something broke through the thick fog of his despair. A spark of the man he used to be, the man who believed in justice, ignited in the darkness. He couldn't save his own family. Their killers would never face a judge. But he had stumbled upon another crime, another story of the powerful preying on the weak. For the first time in years, Adekunle Okoro had a reason to fight. It wasn't for redemption, but for defiance. It was a chance to scream into the void, to stop one more injustice, to make one thing right in a world that had gone so horribly wrong. Long before Jide entered her life, Funmilayo Adeleke was a fortress. After her first husband, the great Chief Adeleke, passed away, she had encased her heart in the same steel and concrete that built her empire. She was a titan of industry, a woman whose name could make markets tremble, but in the vast, echoing halls of her Ikoyi mansion, she was profoundly alone. Her days were a whirlwind of board meetings, strategic decisions, and the immense pressure of steering a multinational corporation. Her nights, however, were filled with a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. She was surrounded by staff who catered to her every need, by family who revered her from a respectful distance, but she had no one to share the small human moments with. The empire was her companion, her child, and her prison. She had built walls so high to protect her husband's legacy that she had inadvertently locked herself inside. She was the Lioness of Lagos, a title earned through ruthless negotiation and brilliant foresight. But she was also just a woman, growing older in a gilded cage, starving for a connection that her wealth and power seemed to make impossible. Her loneliness was a quiet, secret ache, a vulnerability hidden behind a mask of unshakable strength. Jide arrived like a sudden, unexpected rain in a long, dry season. They met at a charity gala, an event Funmilayo attended out of duty, her mind already on the next day's financial reports. He was a young, ambitious entrepreneur whose charm was his greatest asset. Unlike other men who approached her with a cloying, transparent awe for her wealth, Jide seemed utterly unimpressed. He spoke to her not as a CEO, but as a woman. He asked about her day, about the art on the walls, about the music. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in years. He pursued her with a gentle, calculated persistence, not with extravagant gifts she could easily buy herself, but with thoughtful gestures that spoke of a deeper attention. He would send her a single, perfect hibiscus flower, remembering an offhand comment she'd made. He would call her late at night, not to talk business, but just to ask if she had eaten. He skillfully dismantled her fortress, not with a battering ram, but by finding the one unlocked door she had forgotten existed, her profound need to be cherished. He made her feel beautiful, desired, and, most importantly, normal. He was an expert hunter. And he knew his prey was not hungry for money, but for affection. Their romance was a whirlwind, a blur of stolen weekends and secret dinners that made Funmilayo feel like a young girl again. When he proposed, just 6 months after they met, she accepted without hesitation. The decision sent shockwaves through her inner circle. Her sister, Auntie Ronke, was the most vocal opponent. "Funmi, open your eyes," she had pleaded. "This boy is a predator. He can smell your money from a mile away." Her board of directors expressed their concerns more diplomatically, citing the age difference and the potential for corporate instability. But Funmilayo was deaf to their warnings. She interpreted their caution as jealousy, as an attempt to control her life. She was a woman who had controlled a billion-naira empire. Surely she could control her own heart. The wedding was a lavish affair, a public declaration of her happiness, but a subtle tension underscored the celebration. The cold, assessing looks Jide exchanged with Auntie Ronke were like a silent declaration of war. Funmilayo, lost in her fairy tale, chose to ignore the warning signs, believing that love, her love, would be strong enough to conquer all doubts. She was a master of the boardroom, but in the arena of the heart, she was a novice, dangerously blinded by her own long-suppressed desires. After the wedding, the fairy tale began to fray at the edges. Jide, now the husband of a billionaire, shed his humble persona like a snake sheds its skin. His business ventures always seemed to be on the verge of a breakthrough, requiring massive urgent infusions of Funmilayo's personal funds. He developed a taste for the kind of ostentatious luxury that the truly wealthy often find vulgar: diamond-encrusted watches, a fleet of sports cars, and high-stakes poker games in Monaco and Dubai. To Funmilayo, he remained the attentive, loving husband, but her staff saw a different man: arrogant, dismissive, and cruel. The mask would slip. He began asking pointed questions about the intricacies of her will, the legal structure of the family trusts, and the succession plan for the company. He framed his inquiries as the responsible concern of a devoted partner wanting to be prepared for any eventuality. But the greed in his eyes was a cold, hard glint that even Funmilayo, in her state of willful blindness, began to notice. The small, thoughtful gestures were replaced by a possessiveness that felt less like love and more like ownership. He was no longer trying to win her heart, he was assessing his assets. The final dark turn came from a place of pure desperation. Funmilayo was in robust health, a strong woman with years of life ahead of her. Jide, however, was drowning in gambling debts owed to dangerous people. The slow game of the loving husband was no longer viable. He needed the full inheritance, and he needed it now. Patience was a luxury he could no longer afford. The predator inside him, long hidden behind a charming smile, was now fully unleashed. His online search history became a chilling litany of his intent. Rare, untraceable poisons, herbal toxins of West Africa, how to induce a heart attack. He reconnected with Dr. Ibrahim, the family physician whose shameful secret he had kept for years, a secret that made the doctor a puppet he could now command. He began to look at his wife not with love but with the cold, detached calculation of an executioner. He would watch her sip her evening tea, the very cup he planned to poison, And he would smile, a loving, tender smile that concealed a heart as black and cold as the grave he was already digging for her in his mind. The hunter was ready to make his kill. The chain Jide used to bind Dr. Ibrahim to his will had been forged years earlier in the crucible of a terrible mistake. The doctor, then a rising star at a prestigious hospital, had made a fatal diagnostic error, costing a wealthy patient his life. The family had prepared a lawsuit that would have ended his career and left him in financial ruin. Jide, through the shadowy network of fixers and influencers he cultivated, had intervened. Evidence was misplaced. Witnesses were persuaded to change their stories, and the lawsuit vanished. Dr. Ibrahim was saved, but his freedom came at a price. He was now owned by Jide, a debt that had been sitting dormant, accruing a silent, terrible interest. Jide called in that debt not with a threat, but with a seductive proposition. He painted Funmilayo as an aging, erratic tyrant whose conservative business decisions were strangling the company's potential. He presented his plan not as a murder, but as a necessary transition, a way to put her to sleep peacefully so that he, with his youthful vision, could save the empire. He assured the terrified doctor that the poison was painless, a gentle release, and that his role was simply to manage the situation and ensure no one grew suspicious. Dr. Ibrahim, a weak man trapped by his past, saw no way out. He was caught between a hypothetical crime and a certain ruin, and he made the cowardly choice to become a conspirator. To find the weapon for his silent war, Jide delved into the forgotten corners of Funmilayo's own history. He tracked down a former groundskeeper from the Adeleke estate, a bitter man named Silas whom Funmilayo had personally fired for theft years ago. Silas, it turned out, was from the same remote village as Funmilayo and Adekunle. For a briefcase full of cash, the man's resentment loosened his tongue. He spoke of the village legends, of the powerful Iwarepe vine, and the secret of its root. He told Jide the folklore of Asoju Urun, explaining how ancient herbalists used it to induce a state of suspended animation so profound it was indistinguishable from death. It was a tool of espionage, a way for a chieftain to fake his own demise to expose the traitors in his court. Silas even spoke of a mythical antidote, a counter-herb that could reverse the effects, but Jide laughed it off. He was a modern man of science and greed. He had no time for superstitious tales of magic cures. He paid Silas handsomely for the information and, more importantly, for a small dried portion of the potent root. He left feeling triumphant, holding in his hand a piece of ancient tradition that he would use to commit a thoroughly modern crime, never suspecting that the very folklore he dismissed held the key to his own undoing. The poisoning was a masterclass in patience and cruelty. Jide, the loving husband, took personal charge of preparing his wife's nightly cup of calming herbal tea, a ritual she cherished. It became his delivery system. Each night he would add a tiny, almost undetectable amount of the finely powdered root to her cup, a slow and steady assault on her nervous system. Over the course of several weeks, he watched with detached fascination as the vibrant, powerful woman he married began to fade. The first signs were subtle, a persistent fatigue she blamed on work, a strange chill in her bones that no blanket could warm. Then came the muscle weakness, the slight tremor in her hands that made signing documents difficult. She grew worried, and Dr. Ibrahim was called. He played his part perfectly, his face a mask of grave concern as he ran a series of pointless tests. He diagnosed her with a rare and aggressive neurological disorder, a fictitious disease that provided the perfect cover story for her eventual, inevitable demise. He created a medical narrative that would lead everyone to the wrong conclusion, meticulously paving the way for a murder that would be mistaken for a tragedy. On the chosen night, With a major business deal set to close in her favour the next morning, Jide decided the time was right. His creditors were growing impatient, and the successful closure of the deal would add another billion naira to the fortune he was poised to inherit. In her final cup of tea, he administered a dose 10 times larger than any he had given her before. He sat with her, holding her hand as she complained of a sudden crushing exhaustion. He watched as her breathing grew shallow, as her limbs grew heavy, as the light in her fierce eyes began to dim. When she finally lost consciousness, he feigned panic, calling Dr. Ibrahim in a frantic, staged phone call. The doctor arrived within minutes, immediately taking command of the situation. He declared it a medical emergency, barred any other staff from the room, and began a performance of futile, life-saving measures. Less than an hour later, he emerged from the bedroom, his face a mask of sorrow, and announced that the great chief Funmilayo Adeleke was gone. The death certificate was signed before the family had even been fully notified, citing cardiac arrest due to complications from her degenerative neurological condition as the cause of death. The lie was complete. The final phase of the plan was a frantic race against time and tradition. A woman of Funmilayo's stature deserved a grand week-long funeral, but Jide knew that time was his enemy. The longer her body remained unburied, the greater the risk of the poison wearing off or someone demanding an autopsy. He weaponized his grief, turning it into a tool to override all cultural expectations. He presented himself as a man so utterly shattered by his loss that he couldn't bear a prolonged public spectacle. He insisted on a quick, private burial to honour her humble nature, a claim so absurdly out of character for Funmilayo that it raised Auntie Ronk's suspicions. The family, disoriented by the shock of the sudden death, reluctantly agreed. The night before the funeral, Jide, needing to steel Dr. Ibrahim's frayed nerves, arranged a final meeting. Fearing they might be seen at the hospital or the house, Jide chose a dark, quiet street beside the lagoon to talk, a place of anonymity right next to the Falomo Bridge. In his arrogance, as he confirmed the final details of his victory, he never noticed the pair of eyes watching from the shadows, the eyes of a forgotten man who understood the language of his village's darkest legends. The aftermath of the cemetery resurrection was a media tsunami. The story was a perfect storm of wealth, betrayal, and the seemingly supernatural. It led every newscast, from Lagos to London. "The lioness roars back from the grave," screamed one headline. "Billionaire's husband arrested at her funeral," shouted another. The Adeleke mansion in Ikoyi became an armed camp, besieged by a relentless army of reporters, satellite trucks, and curious onlookers, all hungry for a glimpse of the woman who had cheated death. Inside, a different kind of storm was raging. Funmilayo was taken to a secure wing of the city's most exclusive hospital, under the care of doctors who were triple vetted by a paranoid Auntie Ronke. She was physically weak, the poison having taken a severe toll, but her mind was sharp, her will unbroken. Meanwhile, Adekunle was no longer a nameless face in the crowd. He was the saviour, the mysterious homeless man at the centre of the story. After giving a detailed statement to the police, he was taken to a safe house, his anonymity shattered forever. He was a key witness in the most sensational crime of the decade, a man who had walked out of the shadows and into the blinding glare of history. The city, the nation, the world, everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next chapter of this unbelievable story to unfold. A few days later, once she was stable and back within the secure walls of her own home, Funmilayo sent for him. Adekunle arrived not as a beggar, but as a guest of honour, dressed in a simple but well-fitting traditional tunic and trousers provided by Auntie Ronke's staff. Walking through the cavernous, art-filled halls of the mansion was a disorienting experience. Each room was a universe of wealth away from the life he had known for years. The plush carpet silenced his footsteps, The air was cool and smelled of lilies, and servants bowed their heads as he passed. It was a world he had once been adjacent to in his academic life, but one he had long since been exiled from. The dizzying contrast between the opulence around him and the harsh reality of the bridge was a stark reminder of the chasm that separated their lives. He was a ghost from another world, an anomaly in this palace of marble and glass, brought here by a twist of fate so bizarre it felt like a dream. He felt the weight of every eye on him, the silent questions, the curiosity. He was the man who had stopped a burial, but here, in the heart of the empire he had saved, he felt more lost than ever. She received him in her private study, a warm wood-panelled room lined with thousands of books. She was seated in a large leather chair, looking smaller and more fragile than he remembered, a blanket draped over her lap. But the fire in her eyes was undiminished. It was the same fierce intelligence he remembered from the girl who used to beat him in races through the village fields. She watched him as he entered, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and a deep, soul-shaking sorrow. She gestured for him to sit, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two survivors of different shipwrecks now stranded on the same shore. Funmilayo was the first to speak, her voice soft but steady. She told him that words like "thank you" were meaningless for the debt she owed him. She had tried to think of how to repay him and had come to the only conclusion a woman like her could. She offered him a new life, a turnkey existence bought and paid for, a furnished luxury apartment in Banana Island, a car with a driver, a bank account with enough money to ensure he would never have to worry again. It was a king's ransom, a generous and genuine offer. It was the only language of gratitude she knew how to speak, the language of money, power, and influence. Adekunle listened patiently, his hands resting calmly in his lap. When she had finished, he gently shook his head. "I don't want your money, Chief Adeleke," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The refusal hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Funmilayo was momentarily speechless. He then leaned forward and, for the first time, told her his own story. He spoke of Anike and Amara, of the black Mercedes, of the senator's son who walked free. He told her of the police reports that vanished, of the witnesses who fell silent, of a justice system that was a marketplace where the rich could buy any verdict they wanted. His voice was devoid of self-pity, a calm recitation of a tragedy that had hollowed out his world. "Your husband is in a police cell," Adekunle finished, his gaze unwavering. "He will stand before a judge. The man who murdered my family lives in a mansion bigger than this one. You have power I can only dream of. You can make calls that generals and ministers will answer. You can hire investigators who cannot be bought. That is my price. Not your money, your power. Get me justice for the wife and daughter I could not protect." Funmilayo was completely shattered by his words. In her world, everyone had a price, usually a monetary one. But this man, who had nothing, was asking for something far more valuable: justice. He was not seeking a handout, but a partnership, a chance to right a wrong that had broken his spirit. She saw him then, not as a project or a charity case, but as a man of immense, unbreakable integrity, a king in rags. His pain resonated with her own fresh betrayal. They were both victims of a world where the powerful believed they were above the law. In that moment of shared understanding, a new bond was forged between them, stronger than any business deal. It was an alliance of survivors. She looked at the man who had saved her life and felt a surge of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This was about more than just gratitude. This was about justice, for him and for herself. "They say a lioness protects her own," she said, her voice ringing with renewed strength. "You are one of us now, Adekunle Okoro. We will hunt him down together. You have my word." This story has so many twists and turns, and it's far from over. If you want to see what happens next, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have hit that notification bell. And I love hearing from you all, so tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this story from right now? It's amazing to see how far our stories travel. Now, let's get back to Funmilayo and Adekunle as they prepare for the fight of their lives. The trial of Jide Adeleke and Dr. Bosed Ibrahim was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national obsession. The courthouse was a fortress, surrounded daily by a carnival of news vans, street vendors selling resurrection-themed memorabilia, and massive crowds straining against police barricades for a glimpse of the key players. Inside, the courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with the weight of expectation. Jide, stripped of his tailored suits and confident swagger, looked like a different man. He sat in the dock, gaunt and pale, his eyes burning with a resentful fire. Beside him, Dr. Ibrahim was a broken man, his head perpetually bowed, as if the guilt was a physical weight pressing him into the ground. Funmilayo made her entrance each day with quiet, regal dignity, flanked by Auntie Ronke and Adekunle. Her presence alone was a powerful testimony, a living, breathing refutation of the crime that had been committed against her. Adekunle, now dressed in sharp, conservative suits, was her silent shadow, his calm demeanour a stark contrast to the chaos that surrounded them. He was no longer an invisible man. He was a symbol of truth, the unlikely hero who had pulled the entire conspiracy into the light. The nation was captivated, watching as the sordid details of a high society betrayal were laid bare for all to see. Jide's defense team, a group of notoriously expensive and ruthless lawyers, went on the attack from the first day. Their strategy was clear: to destroy Adekunle's credibility. They painted him as a mentally unstable vagrant, a known alcoholic with a history of public disturbances. They argued that he had concocted the entire story, perhaps in a drunken stupor, or worse, that he was a pawn in a corporate scheme, paid by Funmilayo's business rivals to create a scandal. The lead attorney sneered as he cross-examined Adekunle. "So, you expect this court to believe," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "that you, a man who sleeps under a bridge, just happened to overhear a secret conversation about a rare, mythical poison, and then just happened to have the even more mythical antidote in your pocket. It sounds less like testimony and more like a fairy tale, wouldn't you agree?" But Adekunle was unshakable. He answered every question calmly and precisely, his voice never wavering. He recounted the conversation he overheard. The specific Yoruba words Jide used, the fear in Dr. Ibrahim's voice. He spoke not with the flourish of a liar, but with the quiet, heavy certainty of a man telling a truth he wished he didn't know. His testimony was powerful in its simplicity, and under the weight of his steady gaze, the lawyer's sarcasm began to sound like desperation. The prosecution's case was a methodical demolition of Jide's lies. They brought in the groundskeeper, Silas, who, after being granted immunity, confessed to providing Jide with the Iwaripi route. They presented financial records detailing Jide's catastrophic gambling debts, providing a clear and desperate motive. A toxicologist testified that trace amounts of the paralytic alkaloid were found in Funmilayo's system, as well as in the dregs of her personal teapot. The most dramatic moment came when Funmilayo herself took the stand. In a clear, unwavering voice, she described the final weeks of her life, the inexplicable fatigue, the chilling coldness, and the loving concern on her husband's face as he personally served her the tea that was slowly killing her. Her testimony was not emotional. It was cold, precise, and utterly damning. She looked directly at Jide as she spoke, her gaze not of a victim, but of a queen passing sentence. "I loved him," she said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "I trusted him with my life, and he tried to steal it from me for money. Jide, who had maintained a facade of arrogant denial, finally broke. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Lies! She was suffocating me. The empire was her only husband. I did what I had to do to be free. His outburst was a full confession, a cry of greed and resentment that sealed his fate. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel, but the sound was drowned out by the gasps and shouts of the gallery. Jide's lawyers slumped in their chairs, their heads in their hands, their multi-million Naira defense strategy destroyed by their own client's explosive ego. Dr. Ibrahim, seeing that all was lost, began to sob uncontrollably, his lawyer patting his shoulder in a futile gesture of comfort. The mask was gone, and what was left was ugly and pathetic. A weak man who betrayed his oath, and a greedy man who had mistaken a marriage for a corporate takeover. The prosecution rested its case. There was no need for further witnesses. Jide's own words had been the most powerful testimony against him. The trial, which was expected to last for weeks, was effectively over. All that remained was the verdict, but in the court of public opinion, and in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed his confession, Jide Adeleke was already a condemned man. The lioness had been wounded, but she had not been defeated. She had risen from her own grave to watch her betrayer bury himself. The judge delivered the verdict to a packed and silent courtroom. Guilty. The word fell like a guillotine. Jide Adeleke and Dr. Bosed Ibrahim were found guilty on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. The judge, in his sentencing, was scathing. He called their crime a profound betrayal not only of a wife and a patient, but of human decency itself. He sentenced them both to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Jide received his sentence with a cold, dead-eyed stare, his face a mask of bitter hatred. Dr. Ibrahim collapsed, a heap of broken sobs, and had to be carried from the courtroom. As the guards led Jide away in handcuffs, his eyes met Funmilayo's one last time. There was no remorse in his gaze, only a chilling, venomous promise of eternal resentment. Funmilayo did not flinch. She watched him go, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary sadness. The chapter of her life with him was finally violently closed. The courtroom exploded with applause and cheers as the verdict was announced, but Funmilayo and Adekunle sat silently amidst the storm, their victory a somber, heavy thing. Justice had been served, but the scars of the battle would remain forever. With Jide's trial concluded, Funmilayo turned the full force of her empire towards fulfilling her promise to Adekunle. She unleashed a team of the nation's best private investigators and most tenacious lawyers, a veritable army tasked with one mission: to unravel the cover-up that had protected the senator's son for so long. They were relentless. They tracked down the original witnesses from the accident, offering them full protection and financial security in exchange for their true testimony. The fear that had kept them silent for years was no match for the power and influence of the Adeleke name. A mechanic who had been intimidated into silence came forward with photos he had secretly taken of the senator's car, proving the speed and force of the impact. A paramedic, haunted by his conscience, testified that the police had forced him to alter his report at the scene. The web of lies so carefully woven by the senator's power began to unravel thread by thread. The investigators uncovered a trail of illicit payments, linking the senator directly to the police commissioner and the judge who had dismissed the original case. The story was a bombshell, a scandal that rocked the political establishment to its core. The hunter had become the hunted. The senator, a man who had walked the halls of power with untouchable arrogance, found himself cornered. Funmilayo applied pressure from all sides. She used her media holdings to ensure the story was on the front page of every newspaper and the top of every newscast, refusing to let it be buried. She called in decades of favours from the highest levels of government, demanding that the case be reopened and prosecuted by an independent council. The political cost of protecting the senator's son became too high. Facing impeachment and a full-blown corruption investigation, the senator's allies abandoned him. His son was arrested, the image of the handsome, smiling heir being led away in handcuffs broadcast across the nation. His trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and with the public's eyes fixed on the proceedings, there was no room for political maneuvering. He was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in prison. For Adekunle, who sat in the courtroom every day, the verdict was not a moment of triumph or joy. It was a moment of quiet, profound release, the lifting of a weight he had carried for so long it had become a part of him. Justice had not brought his family back, but it had finally honoured their memory. The world was righted, not completely, but enough. With the ghosts of his past finally laid to rest, Adekunle began the slow, difficult process of rejoining the world of the living. The anger and despair that had been his constant companions for years began to recede, leaving behind a vast, quiet space for something new to grow. He was no longer a ghost haunting the city, he was Adekunle Okoro once more. True to her word, Funmilayo did not offer him a handout but a purpose. She had seen his sharp intellect, his unwavering moral compass, and his deep empathy for the forgotten. She asked him to become the head of the Adeleke Foundation, the charitable arm of her company, with a mandate to completely reshape its mission. She gave him a blank check and full autonomy to build something meaningful. He accepted, not out of a sense of obligation, but because he saw a chance to give his own survival a purpose. He had been shown a mercy he never expected, and he was determined to spend his second chance at life extending that same mercy to others who were lost in the darkness. Adekunle threw himself into the work with the same passion he had once reserved for his historical research. He transformed the foundation from a typical corporate charity, focused on photo opportunities and galas, into a powerful engine for grassroots change. His first project was to build a network of state-of-the-art shelters and rehabilitation centres for the homeless population of Lagos, facilities that offered not just a bed and a meal, but job training, psychological counselling, and legal aid. He knew their struggles intimately. He had lived them. He moved through the city's underbelly, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a brother, speaking to the men and women on the streets with a respect and understanding that no one else could. He sought out the powerless, the victims of injustice, the people whose cases had been ignored by the same broken system that had failed him. The foundation became a beacon of hope, a place where the voiceless could finally find someone to listen. He was no longer just a survivor, he was a warrior, fighting for the army of forgotten souls he had left behind. Funmilayo watched his transformation with a sense of profound pride and admiration. She had given him the resources, but the vision, the heart, and the relentless drive were all his own. Their relationship evolved into something rare and beautiful, a deep platonic bond forged in the crucible of their shared trauma. They were not lovers, but soulmates in survival. They would spend hours in her study, not discussing business, but life, philosophy, and the nature of justice. He grounded her, reminding her of the world outside her boardroom, and she empowered him, giving him the tools to turn his pain into a legacy. She had saved him from the streets, but in a way, he had saved her too. He had rescued her not just from a premature grave, but from the gilded cage of her own loneliness. He had brought a purpose back into her life that was bigger than balance sheets and stock prices. Together, two broken people, one who had lost her heart and another who had lost his family, began to build a new world from the ashes of their old ones. They were no longer just survivors, they were architects of a new beginning. A year passed, a year of healing and rebuilding. The scandalous headlines faded, replaced by stories of the remarkable work being done by the Adeleke Foundation. Adekunle, once a spectre on the streets, was now a respected public figure, a passionate advocate for the city's marginalized communities. He moved with a newfound confidence, the shadows of his past receding in the light of his new purpose. His relationship with Funmilayo remained the anchor of his new life. They were an unlikely pair, the formidable billionaire and the quiet, unassuming philanthropist. Their friendship was the subject of much gossip, with tabloids speculating about a secret romance. But the truth was deeper and more profound than that. It was a partnership of souls, a meeting of two minds who understood the fragility of life and the immense value of a second chance. There was no romance between them, but there was a powerful, unshakable love, the kind that exists between soldiers who have survived the same war. They had walked through the valley of death together, and that bond was something no one else could ever understand. Funmilayo, for her part, found a quiet contentment in her new life, her focus shifting from corporate conquest to meaningful philanthropy, guided by Adekunle's vision. It was through his work at the foundation that Adekunle met Jide. She was a social worker, a woman with a gentle smile and eyes that held a universe of compassion. She had worked in the trenches of the city's poverty for over a decade, driven by a quiet but fierce determination to make a difference. She was unimpressed by Adekunle's new title or his connection to the Adeleke Empire. Instead, she was drawn to the quiet sadness that still lingered in his eyes and the profound empathy he showed to every person who walked through the foundation's doors. They began working closely on a project to support children orphaned by street violence. He was struck by her resilience, her humour, and her unwavering belief in the good of humanity, a belief he thought he had lost forever. She, in turn, saw past the celebrated hero and saw the wounded man beneath, a man who still needed healing. Their relationship grew slowly, cautiously, a tender green shoot pushing its way through the hard, desolate ground of his grief. For the first time since he lost Anike, Adekunle felt the stirring of hope in his heart, the possibility of a future that was not defined solely by his loss. When Adekunle told Funmilayo about Jide, he did so with the nervous energy of a young man seeking a parent's approval. They were in the garden of the mansion, a place that had become their sanctuary. He told her how Jide made him laugh, how she understood his silences, how she made him feel like the man he was before the tragedy, not just the man he became after. Funmilayo listened, her expression unreadable at first. A small, selfish part of her felt a pang of loss. Adekunle had been hers in a way, her partner in survival. But that feeling was quickly overwhelmed by a wave of genuine, selfless happiness for him. She saw the light back in his eyes, a brightness that had been absent even after he had found justice. She knew that while she had given him a purpose, Jide was offering him a life. She reached across the table and took his hand, her smile warm and sincere. "She is a lucky woman, Kunle," she said softly. "You deserve all the happiness in the world. You must bring her to dinner. Auntie Ronke will want to inspect her, of course." He let out a laugh, a full, genuine sound that made Funmilayo's heart soar. It was the sound of a man coming home to himself. While Adekunle was rediscovering love, Funmilayo was rediscovering peace. She found that her own happiness did not require a partner. She had her family, her work with the foundation, and her deep friendship with Adekunle. She had spent so long defining herself as a wife, first to Chief Adeleke, then to Jide, that she had forgotten how to be just Funmilayo. Her near-death experience had been a violent, brutal rebirth. It had stripped away her illusions and forced her to confront her own vulnerabilities. She no longer felt the need for a man to complete her or to validate her existence. She found joy in small things, watching her grandnephews and nieces play in the garden, reading a book without interruption, mentoring young female entrepreneurs. She travelled not for business, but for pleasure, seeing the wonders of the world she had only ever flown over on her way to a meeting. Her empire continued to thrive, but it no longer owned her. She was its master, not its servant. The fortress she had built around her heart was dismantled, not for a new love to enter, but to let the sunlight in. She was whole on her own, a solitary, magnificent Iroko tree, standing strong and secure in her own soil. The two friends, once bound by a shared trauma, were now walking on separate but parallel paths to happiness. Adekunle's journey was one of rediscovery, of finding love again after a devastating loss. Funmilayo's was a journey of self-discovery, of finding peace and contentment in her own strength and solitude. Their lives were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They had both been to the brink of annihilation, one buried by injustice, the other by betrayal. Yet, they had not only survived, but they had thrived. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something new and beautiful. They were living proof that the end of one story is often just the beginning of another, and that the deepest wounds can, with time and grace, become sources of the greatest strength. Their unlikely friendship, born in the shadow of a grave, had blossomed into a powerful force for good, a partnership that was not only rebuilding their own lives, but was also transforming the lives of countless others. They had found their new beginning, not in forgetting the past, but in using it to build a better future. 5 years later, the garden of Funmilayo's mansion was filled with the sounds of joy and celebration. It was the day of Adekunle and Sade's traditional wedding, a vibrant, beautiful affair that brought together two very different worlds. On one side were the powerful and elite of Lagos, friends and associates of Funmilayo, who served as the proud chairwoman of the event. On the other side were the people whose lives the Adeleke Foundation had touched: social workers, rehabilitated street children, and families who had found justice through Adekunle's work. It was a testament to the world he and Funmilayo had built together, a world where the lines between the powerful and the powerless were blurred by a shared sense of community. Adekunle stood tall and proud in his flowing white agbada, his eyes fixed on Sade as she walked towards him, a vision of grace and beauty. Funmilayo watched from the front row, a serene smile on her face. Her heart was full, not with the bittersweet longing of a lost love, but with the pure, uncomplicated joy of seeing her dearest friend, her brother in spirit, find the happiness he so richly deserved. This was the true victory, not the prison sentences, not the corporate success, but this, life, love, and the promise of a new generation. In the quiet solitude of his maximum security prison cell, Jide Adeleke was a withered husk of the man he once was. The anger and arrogance had long since burned out, leaving behind only the cold, grey ash of regret. The endless, monotonous days had given him something he'd never had in his previous life: time for reflection. He was haunted not by the wealth he had lost, but by the memory of Funmilayo's face in the courtroom, not her anger, but her sadness. He finally understood that he had tried to destroy the one person who had shown him genuine affection, a crime far worse than attempted murder. He began to write her letters, not at first, but after years of silence. They were not pleas for forgiveness or excuses for his actions. They were simple, raw confessions of his own moral bankruptcy. He wrote about his envy, his insecurity, and the all-consuming greed that had poisoned his soul. "I was a boy playing at being a king," he wrote in one letter, "and I tried to kill the queen because her crown was heavier than mine. I see that now. I pray you find peace." Funmilayo read each letter, and after years of holding on to her justified anger, she finally let it go. She wrote back a single sentence: "I found peace the day I forgave you." Forgiveness, she had learned, was not for the sinner, but for the sinned against. It was the final act of taking her power back. Funmilayo's own life had settled into a rhythm of peaceful productivity. Her days were still busy, managing her vast business interests and overseeing the foundation. But she worked with a newfound sense of balance. She had delegated more responsibility, trusting the next generation of leaders she had mentored. Her greatest joy was her family. She was the matriarch, the strong centre around which her nieces, nephews, and their children revolved. Auntie Ronka, her fierce protector, was now her constant companion, the two sisters enjoying an easy, comfortable friendship in their later years. Funmilayo never remarried. She had lovers, discreet and respectful men who enjoyed her company, but she never again allowed anyone to become the centre of her world. She was her own centre. She had faced death and betrayal and had emerged stronger and wiser. She had learned that a full life did not require a husband, only a full heart. Her legacy, she had decided, would not just be the company she ran, but the lives the foundation changed, and the story of the woman who had walked out of her own grave to teach the world about resilience. On the 10th anniversary of what the media still called the Resurrection Day, Funmilayo hosted a small gathering in her garden. Adekunle and Jide were there with their two young children, a boy named Akin and a girl named Adeleke, after the wife he had lost and never forgotten. Auntie Ronki was there, her sharp edges softened by age. They didn't speak of the past, of the casket and the courtroom. Instead, they spoke of the future, of new schools the foundation was building, of their children's latest antics. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Funmilayo looked at Adekunle, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. He knew what she meant. He nodded, watching his daughter play on the grass. "I think about who I was then," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I am grateful for the man I was forced to become." Their journey had been born from unimaginable pain, a story of death, grief, and betrayal. But it had transformed into a story of hope, justice, and redemption. Their intertwined lives stood as a powerful testament to the idea that even in the darkest of graves, a seed of hope can grow. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, a profound sense of peace descended upon the small group. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by the fires of adversity. They were survivors who had learned that the greatest treasures in life were not material wealth or power, but loyalty, love, and the courage to fight for what is right. Funmilayo Adeleke, the woman who was supposed to be a memory, was now a grandmother figure, her laughter mingling with the squeals of children. Adekunle Okoro, the man who was supposed to be a forgotten ghost, was now a husband and father, a builder of futures. Their story, which began with a shout that stopped a burial, ended in a quiet garden, in the gentle hum of a family at peace. It was a reminder that from betrayal, trust can be reborn, that from injustice, a new kind of justice can be forged, and that, from the ashes of a life that is lost, a new dawn will always, eventually, come.